New York never sleeps, but a man was sinking into a haze of his own. Not sleep, but a weariness so profound that even dreams no longer cared to knock. Andrew Sullivan sat motionless by the glass window on the 83rd floor of a skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. Below his feet, lines of cars crawled like ants in a maze of lights. The third glass of whiskey that night was in his hand, but the liquor burn no longer had the strength to sear through the loneliness that had long taken root in his heart. He, the powerful CEO of a multinational investment conglomerate, the young billionaire once dubbed a financial prodigy by Fortune magazine, the man who once made Wall Street bow to his daring vision. Yet this very man was now grappling with something that couldn't be measured in money emptiness. Doctors said he had chronic insomnia due to prolonged neurological stress. Sleeping pills had become his constant companions. Small white tablets, one after another, slowly turned him into a man suspended between day and night. He could no longer tell the difference between morning light, the sound of meeting alerts, or a heartfelt word from another human being, if such things still existed in his life. Some say power isolates people. However, the pain of betrayal, broken relationships, and the sense that no one truly saw him formed the cruelest kind of isolation for Andrew. He had loved before, but that love could not outshine the shadow of fame and figures. People came to him for the name Sullivan, but they left because of Andrew, the wounded man they couldn't endure. The platinum Rolex on his wrist stopped at exactly 3:12 a.m. Perhaps the battery had died, and like him, slowly drained of life. "You need rest, Andrew," his assistant Christine had once said, her eyes filled with concern. "I booked a session at a therapy spa near Central Park. Just 1 hour. Please don't say no." He said nothing, not because he agreed, but because he no longer had the strength to object. 1 hour in a warm, dimly lit room with the scent of essential oils and soft music. Could that save a soul that had already rotted from the inside? He didn't believe it. But he had nothing left to lose. On the other side of the city, a woman was lighting scented candles and folding ivory white towels in a small room. Her hands were gentle, full of intuition, sensing tense muscles and the places where a heart had once shattered. She didn't know that a pair of lost eyes would find their way to her hands tomorrow. And from there, a healing journey would begin, not just for one, but for both. Sometimes life doesn't need a grand miracle. Just one touch at the right time. One person willing to listen, not with their ears, but with their heart. If you've ever felt tired beneath the glittering lights, or lived as though you had everything, yet still felt something was missing, perhaps this story is for you. Tap the heart if you see a part of yourself in this story. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. Someone out there might need a word of comfort too. And if you wish to continue the healing journey with Andrew and Amara, don't forget to follow the channel. The most beautiful things often begin with a small, simple connection like this. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the fogged-up window panes of Harlem, a small room, modestly decorated, yet filled with the scent of lavender and cedarwood, glowed softly in the pale morning light. Nestled quietly between rows of old brownstones, the spa had no flashy sign, no glittering price list, only a deep indigo silk curtain and a hand-carved wooden sign bearing one simple inscription: stillness and skin. Amara Johnson was gently rubbing nourishing oil inside the room into her hands, a ritual she performed before ever laying hands on another person. It wasn't just to soften or warm them. It was a way to still her spirit before passing on a piece of that calm to someone else. She wasn't beautiful in a dazzling way, but carried a quiet allure, like the soft morning light diffused by mist. Her brown skin shimmered under the early sun. Her black curls tumbled down her shoulders like grapevines, and her deep eyes, like rain-fed lakes, always looked at people as if they were a world to be understood, not judged. People said her hands worked miracles, Some came in with pain coiled tight from stress and left so tranquil that tears rolled down their cheeks without knowing why. Some who hadn't been able to move an arm found themselves stretching freely after a few sessions with Amara, as if the injury had never existed. But Amara never called herself a healer. She listened silently and intently to each person's body with her hands. "Touch the place where it hurts the most," she once said. Not the place they say it hurts, but the place they don't dare to touch. Today her schedule was packed from morning to evening. But there was one unusual appointment, a new client booked by the man's assistant. She rarely accepted clients who didn't reach out personally. Yet something in the woman's anxious voice gave Amara a strange feeling, as if something might change after this session. That afternoon, a drizzle fell over the rooftops. A luxury car pulled up outside the shop. The man who stepped out looked unlike anyone who had ever set foot there. A flawless, ash-gray suit, a gleaming silver watch, sunken eyes, and skin the color of salted snow worn with exhaustion. He sat in the waiting chair, as if he were on trial for his own life. No small talk, no polite gestures. Just a heavy silence wrapped in a cold energy that seemed to pull the entire room inward. Amara stepped out wearing a white linen robe, her face unreadable but her eyes gentle. "You must be Andrew," she asked softly, her voice like the sound of string instruments. The man nodded, his eyes glancing briefly at her before dropping again, evasive. She invited him into the room. He followed like a shadow. The room was dim. No lights, just the soft golden glow of candles and the scent of melting beeswax. Andrew lay down on the massage table, his face turned into the pillow, eyes closed. The air paused as Amara placed her palms gently on his shoulder. She closed her eyes. Her hands began to move lightly, slowly, not rushing, not pressing. It was as if she were speaking to each muscle, each knot of tension, and each nameless memory trapped inside his body. Not a single word was exchanged, yet a feeling began to spread, warm, deep, unexpectedly close. In one fleeting moment, Andrew felt something inside him start to loosen. It had been so long since he had allowed anyone to touch him, not just physically, but in that deeper way that cracks open the walls of self-defense. From those hands, a gentle wave swept through every lifeless cell in him. And then, something that hadn't happened in years occurred. Andrew drifted off to sleep. Not because of pills, not because of exhaustion, but from a surrender that was deeply human, deeply peaceful. As if his soul, after wandering for years, had finally found a place to rest. When he awoke, Amara was gone. A steaming cup of peppermint tea sat neatly on the table beside the chair. No note, no bill. Only a small piece of paper, with handwriting as gentle as the hands that wrote it. When the body is heard, the heart begins to speak. Andrew held the note for a long time. He wasn't thinking about meetings, financial metrics, or stock performance for the first time in years. He was thinking about those hands, and the woman who owned them. The late autumn breeze whispered through Madison Avenue, lifting dry leaves into the air like forgotten letters. The city was still bustling, hurried and proud in its noisy grandeur. But within Andrew, something had quietly shifted, a hollow space that had subtly changed, even if he couldn't name it yet. Ever since that afternoon when he had fallen asleep under the hands of a stranger, something in him seemed to have slowed down. That sleep wasn't long, but when he opened his eyes, he felt like he had fallen into a stillness he'd never known before, a place where the world's noise couldn't reach him. Andrew didn't tell anyone about the experience. Not his therapist. Not Christine, the loyal assistant who had stood by him for nearly a decade. He didn't want to explain it because he didn't understand it himself. He opened his calendar the next morning, found a rare gap in his schedule, and booked another appointment at that spa. In his handwriting, he jotted, "Stillness and skin, 5 p.m." For the first time, the entry wasn't for a meeting, a deal, or something. Gentler. The room remained the same. The golden candlelight, the soft aroma of essential oils, the meditative music like water dripping on stone. But today, Amara didn't ask him to lie down immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then gently invited him to sit in the chair by the window, where the setting sun painted streaks of golden light across the old wooden wall. "Before you lie down," she said, her voice low and rich like velvet, "I want to ask you something. Do you remember the last time someone touched you?" Andrew paused. He hadn't expected that from a massage therapist. It wasn't a clinical question. It was a human one. He didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't remember. He had lovers, many. But those touches had been of the body, not of the soul. Fingers that landed on his skin felt more like they were searching for a bank account, not the fractures in his heart. And so he shook his head. Amara didn't press. She smiled so faintly that had he not looked carefully, he might have thought it a mirage. "Then, today we'll start from there," she said, walking toward the treatment table. He lay down again, but this time with a different presence. Not guarded, not surrendered, but a kind of quiet opening that needed no words. Her hands touched his back as they had before. But this time it wasn't just warmth. It was a depth, a truth, each point of contact seeming to read pieces of memory he had long tried to forget. She didn't press hard, didn't force anything. She placed her hands and waited until his body exhaled, as if confessing something. He felt himself shedding layers, like an old tree, releasing dead leaves to reveal a softer, more vulnerable bark beneath something truer. Andrew didn't realize his eyes had grown misty in the flickering candlelight. Not from pain, but from a nameless kind of release. After the session, he said nothing. There was no need for thanks. He quietly put on his coat, left a credit card on the counter, and walked out as if leaving a chapel he'd never believed in. Amara watched him go. She didn't smile, didn't stop him. But deep inside she knew that man would return. Not because of massage techniques, not because of scented oils, but because of that rare feeling of being seen in a way he hadn't been for a very long time. That evening, Andrew returned to his penthouse, a space filled with everything from fine art to cutting-edge technology, but void of human warmth. He stepped into the kitchen, opened the fridge, then closed it again, an old habit that led nowhere. On the table, the note Amara had once left was still there. He'd kept it folded neatly beneath a whiskey glass. When the body is heard, the heart begins to speak. He unfolded the note once more, reading each word slowly. And then for the first time in many years, he laughed. Softly, like an apology to himself. Somewhere else in the city, the woman with the quiet hands was also sitting by her window, brewing a cup of peppermint tea just for herself. She wasn't waiting, wasn't hoping. But there was a tender light in her eyes, the kind found in someone who already knows that a door has quietly opened. Not out there, but inside the heart of a stranger. New York was entering its early winter days. The wind whistled gently through alleyways like whispers from sleepless souls. Streetlights glimmered against the streaks of water on the pavement, reflecting the shadows of hurried passers-by, everyone walking as if chasing something that had just slipped from their grasp. Andrew Sullivan appeared within that frame, wearing a long charcoal overcoat, the collar turned up to cover half his face. He walked as he always did, shoulders straight, gaze distant, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a coffee cup from which he hadn't taken a sip. But today, there was one difference. He was walking. No limousine, No assistant. No back-to-back meetings. He spent the entire afternoon wandering through narrow streets as if trying to reconnect with the feeling of being human beneath the cold armor of cars and numbers. His destination was stillness and skin. The glass door opened with a soft chime. The room remained unchanged, the scent of lavender, the golden candlelight, the strangely warm air that made the outside world feel like a different realm, and this space a sacred sanctuary. Amara stepped out from behind the curtain. She didn't appear surprised to see him return, nor did she smile too broadly, just a subtle, measured nod. Yet something in her gaze paused just a beat longer than usual. Andrew said nothing. He looked at her a glance that lasted longer than it should have. Not out of curiosity, not judgment, but the quiet discovery of a man beginning to realize something about this woman made everything else feel meaningless. She wore no makeup, just a simple indigo robe, her hair tied up, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. But it was her eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen more pain than most therapists, that made his thoughts halt without warning. They exchanged a look wordless, and it was the first time he had ever felt truly seen. During that day's session, Andrew did not fall asleep. Not from tension, but because he wanted to feel every second of her touch. Every gentle stroke across his shoulders, every slow circle her fingers traced on his back, felt like it was awakening a part of him long asleep. His body was used to pressure, but not to tenderness. Familiar with binding contracts, but unfamiliar with the surrender of trust. At one moment, he opened his eyes slightly and glanced at the angled mirror on the wall, just enough to catch a glimpse of her bent in focus, the candlelight casting a golden sheen on her skin. It was the first time he truly looked at her, and the first time in his eyes, something shifted. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't desired. It was a quiet admission this woman possessed something he, a man who had everything, had never known. After the session, Amara offered him a cup of ginger tea as usual, but this time he didn't rush to leave. He sat on the wicker chair by the window, the warm cup in his hands, eyes fixed on the maple tree shedding leaves outside. "You haven't asked me anything," he said, his voice raspy as if unused all day. Amara tilted her head slightly. "I don't need to," she replied, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "Because you already know." "No." She took a sip of tea. "Because some pain just needs to exist quietly. It doesn't need to be dissected. It doesn't need a name." Andrew looked at her for a long while. Then, unexpectedly, he gave a faint smile. A smile not quite joyful or sad, just a new crease on a face too familiar with numbness. This woman wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She didn't try to be wise, nor did she fear silence. Around her, he didn't have to be anyone. And that, more than anything, made him a man who had learned to doubt everything, want to believe just once more. That evening, back at home, Andrew sat for a long time in his office, staring out at the city ablaze with light. But his mind wasn't on reports or market indexes. He was thinking about a look, about the first time he had truly seen and been seen. Something was beginning quiet and steady like an underground stream, not strong enough to break the surface, but no longer possible to ignore. Somewhere in the back of his mind he knew that first look wasn't meant to be admired. It was meant to be remembered. On a late winter afternoon, the light outside the window was blotched like an old painting. The damp chill in the air made everything blur, as if the world was veiling its memories in mist. Andrew arrived later than usual. A few lingering raindrops clung to the dark folds of his coat, but no one mentioned it. Amara laid a cotton towel on the table. She opened the drawer to retrieve the familiar bottle of essential oil sandalwood blended with lavender, a scent like time whispering through the room. She didn't ask why he was late. He didn't explain. Their sessions had long since moved past the need for words. Every gesture, every glance, carried its language, the language of silence that listens. Today, Andrew didn't lie down on the treatment table as usual. He sat in a chair, eyes fixed on Amara's hands, moving slowly as she rubbed oil into her palms. "What makes them so special?" he asked, his voice light, neither mocking nor skeptical. Amara paused. She looked down at her hands. Long fingers, dark brown, skin, faint blue veins, like tiny rivers, running beneath the warm lamp glow. "They used to be nothing at all," she said quietly. "Just two hands belonging to a child no one wanted to hold." Andrew didn't speak, but he knew she was sharing something important. And he had learned that, with Amara, every story came only when it was ready, never a moment too soon. Amara was born in Louisiana, where summer afternoons were so hot that time seemed to melt off the rooftops. She grew up in a wooden house on the edge of the forest with her grandmother, a brown-skinned woman with eyes that saw straight through people and hands that always smelled of fresh mint. Amara's mother left when she was 4, leaving behind a crying child and a short, shaky note. "Mama, please take care of her. I can't do this anymore." Amara grew up walking the thin line between lack and love. Her grandmother was not wealthy, but she never let her feel poor. She taught Amara how to brew ginger water to steam away the chills of a rainy day and gather mint leaves and wild chamomile to make scented sachets beneath her pillow. Most importantly, she taught her how to touch others, not just with skin, but also with the heart. "Never touch someone if you're angry," her grandmother once said. "Hands don't speak, but people feel them. Anger travels from palm to flesh faster than any harsh word." At first, Amara didn't understand. But as she grew, she began to notice something strange. The heat seemed to subside faster when she touched a fevered friend's forehead. When she hugged someone sobbing, the cries seemed to dissolve in her warmth. And when she felt the hand of a man who had lost his daughter in an accident, just a simple hold, he burst into tears. Something years of therapy had never managed to do. No one could explain it, not even Amara. Only her grandmother on her deathbed whispered with her last breath as she gripped Amara's hands. "Your hands carry the breath of the earth. They hear the pain people don't know how to name." Amara shared these things with Andrew in a voice devoid of tragedy, without tears, as though she no longer held on to the sorrow, only the truth, like a gardener who keeps seeds, but not the winter. Andrew sat in stillness, not because the story was dramatic, but because for the first time he saw something sacred in something not tied to religion, not in scriptures, not in myths. Just a pair of hands like any others, yet carrying something money had never been able to buy: the ability to make someone want to live one more day. He looked down at his hands, which had signed million-dollar contracts and brushed off countless forced handshakes. They were dry, cold, and alone. "As for me," he said like a confession, "I've never touched anyone without calculation." Amara didn't flinch. She looked up at him. In her brown eyes there was no judgment, only reflection, like a mirror showing a truth a person had hidden all their life, yet longed to have acknowledged. Then she said gently, "Let today be the first time." He didn't understand what she meant, but when she stepped closer and placed her hands in his, not for therapy, not to heal, just a simple gesture, Andrew suddenly felt small. Not the kind of small before power, but the kind of small before gentleness. At that moment, he was no longer CEO, no longer a billionaire, no longer a broken man. He was just a human being, touched by another, with a light unseen, but warm enough to awaken long-forgotten corners of himself. And then, he gently closed his fingers around hers, not too tightly, but just enough for time to stop, if only for a breath. It had rained in New York for 3 days straight. The sky was gray like a pencil sketch stretched across the horizon. The streets glistened with rain, and car lights streaked faint reflections on the pavement, shimmering but cold, like beautiful and aching memories. Amara sat alone in the spa, which had closed early. Her hand rested on a cup of tea now cold. Her gaze quietly turned toward the window. Across the street a figure stood motionless, hood drawn low, body stiff, like time had frozen him in place. It was Andrew. No appointment, no call. But he had come. She opened the door. The wind swept in sharp and biting, carrying with it the scent of dampness and something else, the weight of something unsettled. His eyes were different from before, not quiet and composed, but crowded and restless, as if he had run a long way, only to stand still, unsure whether to step forward or walk away. Amara didn't ask. She tilted her head to invite him in, retrieved a dry towel, and softly turned on the heater. "Would you like to lie down?" she asked. Andrew shook his head. "I didn't come for therapy." "Then what did you come for?" He looked at her, a long, direct gaze like he was trying to release something locked away for too long. I've hurt people, a lot of people, but I've never felt pain like this." Amara said nothing, but she sat in the chair across from him, waiting for him to exhale. And then he began to speak, not in order, not in structure, just a stream of tangled memories unraveling like a snapped thread. Andrew's childhood wasn't marked by poverty. On the contrary, he was raised in luxury, a mansion with a golf course, private schools, and European summers. But what he lacked was the most basic thing: a real hug. His ruthless businessman father raised his son by asking, "Do you know how many people would kill to have your place?" His mother was elegant, but cold, beautiful, like an oil painting, but never one to bend down and wipe away a tear. The family threw a party when Andrew got into Harvard on a full scholarship. But no one asked if he was tired. When he landed his first deal at 27, his father nodded, "Good. What's next?" And when the woman he loved in college left him, all she left behind was one line: "I don't know if I'm in love with someone or a machine." Andrew stood in front of the mirror that night, unable to cry. Not because he was strong, but because he no longer knew what crying felt like. "I thought I didn't need anyone." He looked at Amara, eyes bloodshot but dry. "I controlled everything. But last night, I smashed everything in my house. Just because I saw your face in a dream." Amara didn't blink. She didn't interrupt. She didn't move closer. But something in the room shifted, as if pain had finally been touched for the first time by eyes that didn't judge. Andrew lowered his head. His hands trembled. His lips were pressed tight. Inside this accomplished man was still a boy who had been crying out for help, but no one had ever stopped to listen. And then he said something, a sentence like the final crack before a dam bursts. "Do you know what the worst feeling is? It's achieving everything and realizing no one sees you as human anymore." Amara stood and stepped closer. Not too fast, not too slow. She knelt beside him, touched his shoulder, and gently pulled him into her arms. It wasn't a desperate hug. It wasn't meant to comfort. It was simply presence. Andrew froze. No one had ever held him like that. Not out of love, not out of need, but simply because he was in pain. No more words. Only the sound of rain tapping gently on the glass roof. And a man was allowed to touch his pain for the first time in his life, Not to escape it, but to begin accepting it. That night, Andrew didn't go home. He didn't check into a hotel or call for a car. He walked through the rain, letting it fall over him like some quiet form of cleansing, one that needed no justification. He didn't know if tomorrow would be better or if he would slip back into familiar darkness. But tonight, he knew one thing. There are cracks that no longer need to be hidden, because there had been a gentle gaze and an embrace patient enough to stand with him before them and not look away. Snow fell in mid-November earlier than usual. The city of Manhattan looked like it had been draped in a white veil, heartbreakingly beautiful, but bone-chillingly cold. Under the streetlights, the bare tree branches sparkled like shattered glass, creating a scene that felt pure and strangely fragile. Inside an upscale cafe in the Upper East Side, golden lighting warmed the space. Porcelain clinked gently, and people spoke in voices just low enough to preserve an air of refined civility. Andrew sat at a window-side table expressionless, his coffee untouched and long since cold. Across from him sat 3 members of the corporate board, all older men in impeccably tailored suits, silver hair slicked back with glossy gel. They never looked him directly in the eye, but every word they spoke hit its target with ruthless precision. Andrew, we understand you're going through some personal things, but you've seen what the media is saying. She's not the image our shareholders want associated with the brand. A spa in Harlem. Andrew, really? Andrew said nothing. His lips pressed into a thin line, chin lifting slightly, an unconscious reflex he had whenever he was cornered and forced to choose. It had all started with a blurry photo posted by a gossip blog that specialized in tracking the lives of the wealthy. In the picture, Andrew was seen exiting Amara's spa shirt, slightly unbuttoned, his gaze distant, and a faint smile on his lips, a smile rarely seen on his face, and certainly never in financial news. That was all it took. Rumors spread like wildfire. Sensational headlines followed Manhattan billionaire and his mysterious woman of color, the woman who made Andrew Sullivan miss the Davos summit, inside the spa with no website that attracts Wall Street's top CEO. No one asked who Amara was. They only cared what she looked like, where she came from, and how someone like him could step out of the golden lattice of high society to touch a woman without a single prestigious emblem attached to her name. On social media, people cloaked their bias in falsely sweet language. She seems genuine, but is it not about the money? No offense, I'm not racist. I find it surprising. A white CEO in love with a black woman in Harlem sounds like a Netflix script. And while the world debated, the 2 people at the center remained silent. Amara had expected this. From the first time she saw Andrew's gaze linger a beat too long, she knew his world was not hers. And no matter how respectfully or quietly he stepped into hers, the gaze from outside would always be sharp, always needing to categorize, to label, to feel safe. She wasn't angry, nor was she sad. She continued her work, like any other day, greeting clients in her warm, even voice, brewing peppermint tea after each session. But when the door opened one Wednesday afternoon, and Andrew didn't walk in like usual, but stood under the awning, hands in his coat pockets, gaze hesitant, like a child who knew he'd done something wrong, she understood. He hadn't come for therapy. He had come to apologize. "I don't need an apology," she said, as they stood facing each other, 2 chairs apart, with a silence between them wide enough to feel the void. "But I need you to understand I'm not a scratch on your brand image." Andrew looked at her for a long time, then nodded. "I know," he said quietly, "and that's exactly what scares me." Amara tilted her head. Her deep brown eyes remained warm, but now carried a sharpness not to hurt, but to force truth. "You're afraid of me," she said, "or of what I make you confront." The question dropped into the room like a pebble into still water. Small, but enough to send ripples. Andrew didn't answer right away, but his eyes wavered just for a second. And at that moment, Amara knew he had heard her. That night, an official post appeared on the internal page of the company Andrew had founded. Beneath his name, the message was brief. I've always believed leadership isn't just about making the right decisions, but facing the right things, even when they make you feel unsafe. I will not be issuing any press statements regarding my personal life, because no one has ownership over the view into someone else's heart. The message wasn't widely shared, but in the investment world, everyone reads it. Some called him brave, some called it emotional, some smirked. As for Andrew that night, he turned off all the lights in his penthouse, opened the glass doors, and let the cold wind pour in. He stood before the city that had raised him on reason and reputation, but had never taught him how to love without fear. For the first time, he thought of a future without a chairman's seat, without dashboards pulsing with stock prices. Just a small room, a brown-skinned woman, a pair of warm hands, and a gaze that asked nothing of him except to be himself. New York entered December with a wind that cut through skin like blades. The once vibrant street corners now shrank into pale shades of gray, as if the entire city was taking a long breath before winter truly descended. The candlelight still flickered faintly at a small spa nestled in the heart of Harlem. The scent of bergamot and warm sandalwood hung in the quiet air. But today the room was closed to clients. Amara sat behind the counter, one hand holding a cup of tea, the other flipping through an old linen-bound notebook. The pages had yellowed the round handwriting her grandmother's still vivid, the ink seemingly untouched by time. Her eyes paused on a short passage. Never think you must be someone's light. Be the one who keeps them from going dark. She smiled faintly, but at the corner of her eyes, something blurred for a moment. That evening, Andrew came without warning. He brought nothing. No explanation. No appointment. His shadow stretched across the snowy sidewalk like a trail of ink that refused to dry. I don't know why I came, he said, when she opened the door, his eyes hesitant. It's just... The city was too quiet today, and I found myself missing the sound of your breathing. It should have sounded strange, even laughable. But coming from Andrew, it carried an awkward weight, as if he wasn't used to longing for something that couldn't be converted into assets or achievements. Amara didn't answer. She nodded and stepped aside to let him in. They sat across from each other in a room just warm enough. There was no therapy session, no tea, just a silence that needed no decoration, as if both of them understood it was time for the listener to be heard. When I was little, Amara began eyes not meeting his. I lived in 3 different places in the first 6 years of my life. Andrew didn't interrupt. The first was my mother's place, a rented room, cracked walls, grown-up voices arguing through the night. I don't remember her clearly, just the smell of cheap perfume, and the times she hit me when she couldn't sleep. Then I lived with a man she called Uncle. I don't know what he was. I remember his deep voice and his rough hands. One time when my mother wasn't home, he touched me. I cried, but no one believed me. Andrew didn't move, but his palm clenched into a fist. After that, I was sent to my grandmother's. She was the only one who ever looked at me like I was something worthy of existing. Her voice didn't tremble. It was even calm, like someone who had told these stories many times not to share them, but to remind herself, I survived. I used to be afraid to touch anyone, she said, because I thought my hands were dirty. I used to think if I disappeared, no one would notice. And then, one day, this little girl was teased for not having a father. She hid in a corner crying. No one dared go near. I walked over and just placed a hand on her shoulder. She stopped crying. She looked up then, her deep brown eyes now locked onto his. That was the first time I understood my hands weren't just meant to carry weight. They could be where someone leans on when they have nowhere else to go. Andrew looked at her for a long time. In the dim light, he could see faint marks on her face, not wrinkles, but traces of a life that had grown up alone. He wanted to say something, a comfort, a word to soften the moment, but everything shattered before it could take form. So instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He walked over and took her hand, not to erase what she had said, but to stay with it. That night, they did not sleep, not out of desire or the hunger of bodies, but they both knew that some stories cannot be told in daylight. Shadows that only reveal themselves when the person before you doesn't try to pull back the curtain, but chooses instead to sit beside you and wait for morning. Amara rested her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, no words. Andrew didn't move, didn't need to explain. In that moment, all definitions of strength or weakness disappeared. There was only someone who had once been broken, and someone who chose not to look away from the pieces. Behind the cold stone walls of a city that never sleeps, two people slowly began to open, layer by layer, with the very things they once feared most, the truth. No promises, no labels, just enough stillness to listen, enough closeness to reach, and enough honesty not to walk away. That morning's dawn was far from beautiful. The sky was a flat, colorless sheet, like an unshaken bedsheet. Clouds hung low like the world's ceiling was about to cave in. The Hudson River flowed quietly, cloaked in a thick fog, like the breath of someone trying to suppress a sob. Amara stood by the treatment room window, holding a cooling cup of peppermint tea. She had never feared a morning, but today, something felt off. Not in the air, but in her chest. A strange unease, like her heart had brushed against an unnamed wind. Her phone buzzed. Linda, a longtime client, a pharmaceutical executive who used to say this spa was her escape from Manhattan's well-groomed cruelty. Amara. Linda's voice was hoarse. "Have you seen the news?" Amara said nothing. Her chest sank, even though she didn't yet know why. What happened? There was a pause on the other end. Andrew is under investigation. The news spread like wildfire across a desert. CNN flashed a blazing red headline: CEO Andrew Sullivan accused of market manipulation. Faces potential hundreds of millions in penalties. Below the banner was a familiar image, his face sharp like a blade, but his eyes changed. Something in them was tired, frayed, as if he had known the storm would come and chose to face it head-on. Amara gripped her phone. Her palm turned clammy and cold. She didn't call him, didn't text a word. Instead, her mind replayed their last night together, his softened gaze yet shadow still lingering deep behind it. He had told her many things, but clearly not everything, and now that past had come to collect him. Andrew didn't show up at the spa that day, nor the day after, nor the entire week that followed. His name saturated the news, from business talk shows to social media to whispered boardroom conversations. Numbers were questioned, sudden trades scrutinized, leaked internal emails dissected. They began to rebuild his public image not as a visionary, but as a manipulator, a man who could move entire markets with one cold call. And threaded through those headlines were subtle hints. Ever since his involvement with a woman outside his class, Andrew Sullivan has seemed less sharp. No one mentioned Amara's name, but she was present in every whisper. On the 10th evening, Andrew returned. Not in a sharp suit, not in a sleek car, but alone in the rain-drenched coat hanging heavy on his shoulders. Hair disheveled, eyes red. Amara opened the door. She didn't speak, didn't embrace him like before. She stepped aside to let him in. Andrew stood in the center of the room, like someone who had both lost their way and awoken in the ruins. He didn't sit, didn't come closer. "I thought I could keep you out of this," he said, voice hoarse, as if scraped from a burning throat. "I was wrong." Amara looked up at him. Her eyes weren't angry. They didn't blame. They carried the weariness of someone left behind too many times without a goodbye. "So why are you here now?" she asked. Andrew blinked. Rain dripped from his hair to his collar. His hands trembled. "I can't drag you into this fire," he whispered. "I'm going to disappear. I have to." The words landed like a quiet blow. Not loud, but enough to crack something in her chest. Amara didn't reach for him, didn't stop him. "You can't leave without ever having stayed," she said softly, like the rain falling outside. "But if that's what you choose, I won't hold you." Andrew gave a twisted smile that couldn't hide the hurt. "You're the one thing I want to hold on to, but also the one thing I'm afraid of." And then he left the way he came, silently soaked like a storm no one saw coming. After that, Amara heard nothing more from him. The city carried on. The streets stayed busy. Sessions continued as always. But each time she placed her hands on someone, there was a quiet hesitation, a slight hollow in her touch, like something essential had been severed. And deep down, she knew love can heal. But it can also leave a wound deeper than any life has ever delivered. In a quiet penthouse high above the city, Andrew sat alone by the window, staring at the metropolis he had once played like chess. Everything had crumbled. Positions, titles, power all falling like late autumn leaves. All except the one thing he had never honestly held and never dared to keep: a pair of hands. Hands he once pulled away from, leaving behind the only person who had ever truly seen him and wasn't afraid. New York had fully stepped into winter. Sunny days became as rare as when people dared to speak honestly amidst crowded streets. The sky no longer shifted in color, holding instead a steady, muted gray, as if it too mourned something that had slipped away unspoken. Stillness and skin remained open every day. Amara still came. Still brewed peppermint tea. Still lit candles. Still folded towels neatly as she had always done. But something in the room had changed. Not in objects, but in the invisible rhythm of breath. There was a space, nameless, shapeless, but undeniably real. Since Andrew left, no one has mentioned him, not even Amara. Yet his absence lingered in every small detail, like the mark left behind on glass after a warm hand lifts away from the cold. Each time a client stepped through the door, she instinctively glanced past them, as if expecting a tall, familiar silhouette to follow quietly. But no, it was never him. And then, she stopped looking. Just as the heart learns how to wait without calling, how to live without seeking. One Friday night, Amara stayed later than usual after all her appointments. She pulled a small wooden box from the bottom drawer. Inside was a piece of paper Andrew had left behind, something she picked up after he had vanished without a goodbye. On it, 2 lines scrawled in hurried blue ink, as though written between breathless moments. "You didn't heal me. I healed myself when I dared to look within. But you gave me the courage to open my eyes." Amara reread it for the who knows how manyth time. Then she closed the box and returned it to its place, just as she had placed him into a quiet compartment in her heart, not forgotten but untouched. Because some people are not held in hand, but kept in the kind of silence that never turns to stone. Elsewhere, just a few blocks away, Andrew sat in his old apartment, the one he used to escape when the world got too loud. It was small, sparsely furnished, and known to no one, not even his assistants. He had lived there since publicly stepping down from all executive roles. A brief statement was released through his lawyer. No explanation. People speculated, then moved on. The financial world doesn't wait for those who leave the table. Andrew sought out no one, nor did he leave the city. He slowed everything down as if relearning how to breathe. Mornings were spent brewing his coffee, evenings reading old books. No social media, no meetings. Just one thing remained constant. He still thought of her. Not a day passed without Amara returning to him. Her hands, her gaze, her voice, and even her silence. Especially the silence. No one waited for him. No one blamed him. But it was the silence that choked him like a man abandoned by his own heart. Once he wrote her a letter. Simple, honest. But he folded it up and tucked it into a drawer. Because he knew some things are better said not with words, but with the presence that should have stayed. The year's final month passed like passengers at a train station, busy, hurried, yet quietly alone. Everything seemed aimed towards something bright: Christmas lights, fireworks, bells ringing. But in the middle of all that brilliance, two people were the quietest of all. Andrew passed by the spa once, accidentally a wrong turn. The lights were on. The windows are clear. But he didn't go in. He stood 3 doors away, watching through the falling snow. And he saw Amara, head bowed, folding towels, movements, slow shoulders, straight, hair tied up. She didn't look toward the door, but her hands paused just for a moment, as if her heart had heard something wordless. Andrew turned and walked away, steps slow, as if the sound of his heels might shatter something fragile. Inside the spa, Amara stood still for a long time after he left. She didn't step outside, didn't open the door. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a blank piece of paper. She wrote the first line. "I don't know where you are in this city anymore, but if one day you find enough peace to face what has come back, not to start over, but to continue, from where we were brave enough to stop." She placed the note into the box alongside the other fragments he had left behind: a suit button, a silver pen, a matchbook from an old bar. As if each one was a way they had called out to each other without ever needing to speak. Some people come into our lives not to stay, but they change us. They teach us how to look in the mirror without shame. They leave behind a voice in our hearts that can't be erased even when all other sounds have faded. And sometimes, it is the silence between two people that becomes the most straightforward way to call each other's name. Not through sound, but through a presence that cannot be forgotten. January. The city lay still beneath a thick layer of snow, like a quiet blanket pulled gently over memory. Harlem had no glass-covered skyscrapers, no high heels echoing across marble floors. This part of the city was a muted hue, where red brick walls held on to memories longer than any data server could. And in winter, every house grew as cold as the past, but just as tender as an old soul song playing from a dusty kitchen radio. Andrew Sullivan stepped out of the subway station with a small backpack on his shoulders, a long gray wool coat draped to his knees, his hair no longer meticulously styled, his face softened by time, but his eyes had changed most. They no longer looked downward like someone calculating, nor far ahead like someone strategizing. They were the eyes of a man learning how to look at the present. It had taken him a long time to realize. Some lives don't need rescuing, only presence. And today, he didn't come to Harlem to reclaim what was lost. He came to meet the version of himself he once refused to accept. Amara was washing her hands in warm water when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. No familiar names on the day's schedule. Yet something stirred in her chest. Not excitement, not anxiety, just a distant echo, like someone calling her name in an old dream. She opened the door, and standing there framed in Harlem snow was Andrew. No suit, No luxury car. No trace of the man whose wealth once made the distance between them feel daunting. Just a man whose once lost eyes now knew how to find their way back. Amara didn't speak, didn't ask. She stepped aside. A small gesture, but perhaps the clearest form of acceptance in that quiet moment. Andrew didn't stay in a hotel. He rented a small room above a laundromat near Marcus Garvey Park. The bed creaked. The radiator groaned whenever wind swept through the cracks. But for the first time in his life, he felt grounded. Each morning he woke early, bought a pastry from the cafe on the corner, and greeted the old man smoking on the stoop with a soft, "Good morning." He learned to wash his hands in cold water, without complaint, to wait patiently in small shops, without glancing at his watch. And every afternoon he returned to Amara's spa, not for therapy, but to help her fold towels, brew tea, and fix the wobbly chairs. At first, she said nothing, but there were days when she forgot to wear gloves while using oil, and his hand would silently reach out to wipe hers. They didn't hold each other's gaze long, but their eyes met more often. No words, just presence long enough for a bruised heart to learn to breathe again. One quiet weekend afternoon, Amara brought Andrew to a small church at the end of the street where she once sang in the children's choir. They sat in the last row, listening to a middle-aged woman sing, "His eye is on the sparrow, with all the sorrow and hope tucked inside every breath." Andrew didn't understand all the lyrics, but he understood what stirred in his chest. A kind of ache without a name. A longing to stay, even if no one asked him to. After the service, they walked home. The wind bit at their faces. Amara pulled a scarf over her hair, her steps steady. "You know," she said without turning to him, "there was a time I never wanted anyone to know this place." Andrew said nothing, because it reminded me of too many things that didn't belong in beautiful dreams. She stopped, turned back to face him. "But now, if someone is here with me, they should know it all. The light and the dark." The wind whispered, not enough to make them shiver, but just enough to turn a sentence into a vow. Andrew didn't reply. He stepped forward and took her hand for the first time since all the silence and separation. That hand was no longer a refuge, no longer a place of healing. It was something tangible to hold on to in the crowded weight of life. That night in his small room, Andrew wrote in a notebook, "Harlem is no longer unfamiliar. It's where she was born, where she hurt. She learned to be gentle with herself, and it's where I learned how to bow my head, listen not as a CEO, not as a man who knows everything, but simply as a man who knows how to stay." He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how his lawsuits would end. I didn't know what would be left after the storm had passed. But he knew one thing. Someone left the door open in a city where no one promised to wait, not out of forgiveness, but because she believed. Those who dare to return are always worthy of being allowed to stay. Winter in Harlem stretched on like a melody that refused to end. But things began to change quietly somewhere in those gray, weary days. Not in grand ways, not with noise. Like the first snowflake landing in an open palm, no one sees the moment it melts, but everyone feels the sweet chill it leaves behind. Andrew began his day by washing dishes, simple worn bowls with chipped enamel rims. He dried each one carefully with a cloth, folded it, and placed it on the shelf. A year ago, he might have called that a waste of time. But now, each motion was like a ritual reminder. He was slowing down, being present, touching his own life again. The small apartment above the laundromat had become a temporary refuge, but also the space where Andrew began to rebuild not an empire but himself. Not a reinvention, a reconstruction. From the foundation he once thought he didn't need. Each morning he wrote in a notebook, Not profit forecasts or strategic plans, but lines like a personal journal. Today my chest feels light. Amara looks at me like I don't have to prove anything. I want to do something not to impress, just to help. The idea came to him one late afternoon while helping Amara unpack new essential oil bottles. A middle-aged client had just finished a session, leaving behind trembling words of gratitude. I don't know why, but I could sleep for the first time in 6 months. Andrew sat still for a moment. Amara asked, "Are you okay?" He nodded. But in his eyes, something had lit up. A rare light he used to show only when discovering a new billion-dollar deal. But this time the light wasn't ambient. It was a desire to build something real. He began drafting a plan in his notebook. A simple platform connecting those in need of emotional care with those who could help, not just professionals, but healers like Amara. People who could listen, touch someone not through expertise, but through presence. He called it Still Mind. No flashy apps, no emotion-manipulating algorithms. Just a space for people to come, not to be fixed, but to be seen, to be understood, and maybe to breathe more gently. Andrew didn't approach investors. He didn't need to. He could start without asking anyone to believe in him with what he had left. What he needed now was a partner from a different world. One afternoon, he handed Amara the draft sunlight, pooling like honey across her cheek. "You don't have to say yes," he said. "But I want you to be the first to know. And if you say yes, the first to build it with me." Amara didn't answer right away. She read line by line, until she reached the last page where he had handwritten a single sentence. Because some hands were never meant to serve only a few. They're meant to reach the ones too afraid to knock. She folded the pages and set them on the table. "You don't need me to validate your kindness," she said. Andrew clenched his hands slightly. "I know. But if you're doing this because you truly believe in it, then I'll be there." Just one sentence, but it softened him thread by thread, as though every rigid day of his past had finally begun to melt in invisible tears. The project was born in a small room at a wooden desk with one broken leg, propped up by an old phone book. They didn't call it a startup. There were no pitch decks, no KPI charts, no talks of quarterly growth. But each morning they opened laptops, brewed tea, and sent out one line of code. One wireframe, one idea, weaving a doorway. A place for people like the old Andrew to arrive and find a hand like the one Amara once offered him. No explanations needed, just presence. A month later, during a quiet roundtable with community mental health advocates, Andrew sat silently among those who had once doubted him. When asked to speak, he said only one thing: "I used to build empires to control the world. Now I want to build a place where people can learn to stay with themselves." No one applauded, but no one left. Because the man standing before them, still Andrew Sullivan, was no longer the towering shadow that once loomed over Manhattan's skyline. He was smaller now, lighter, but more real than he had ever been. By the end of March, New York began to crack open from its frozen shell. Timid green buds began to emerge on branches once brittle like winter's ribs. Not bright, not hurried, as if spring had only gently touched the city's shoulder and whispered, "I'm here now." In the small apartment above the laundromat, Andrew and Amara sat across from each other, each in front of an old laptop. The only sounds were the soft clack of keyboards and their steady breathing. A cup of warm tea sat between them, steam still curling into the air. Still Mind officially launched at the start of the month. No major campaign, no flashy PR. They sent invites to a few familiar faces, those who had once turned to Amara when they had no one left to call, and a handful of Andrew's former colleagues, those who, despite their doubts, still held a quiet respect for him. And from a single private message, to a shared email, to a post on a mental health forum, the story began to spread. A man living alone in Brooklyn, depressed after a divorce, clicked on a link a friend sent him. The note beside it read, "It's not therapy. No advice. Just a place to breathe." He chose the option called quiet listening. A woman in Philadelphia, in her 50s with eyes like Amara's, spoke with him 3 times each session, just 15 minutes. She didn't ask, "Why are you sad?" She didn't tell him to get better. She said, "I'm here." A week later, the man emailed the system. Just one sentence. "Thank you for making me feel not crazy." Stories like that began to surface. Not loudly, not in stock market reports, but in places medicine and money had long been ignored. A freelance journalist wrote an extended personal essay, Hands That Don't Heal, published independently. In it, she described her experience connecting with someone from still mind, a rhythm keeper, as Amara called them. Her words were gentle like silk. "I wasn't fixed, but I was seen." And sometimes being truly seen is the beginning of healing. The essay made its way through writing communities and mental health groups. Some cried. Some quietly shared it with a friend. One message in the feedback inbox read, "I don't know who you are, but you say something I've never been brave enough to say." Andrew and Amara were invited to a small podcast hosted by a Nigerian-American psychologist who interviewed people who had survived life-altering crises. The studio was humble. The recorder occasionally glitched. But the whole room fell silent when Amara began to speak of her grandmother, who used peppermint tea and a fire-warm voice to keep a quiet little girl alive. Andrew didn't speak much, but he looked at her the entire time, as if hearing a story he'd always known, yet still felt new enough to make his chest ache. When the host asked, "What made you a former Wall Street CEO? Choose this path?" Andrew replied, "One day I realized I had gone so far, only to find that the man I wanted to become was waiting back where I had left him." The plain line became the most quoted phrase in the following weeks, not because it was clever, but because it spoke aloud what many were too busy or too afraid to admit. That going far isn't always the same as growing up. They were invited to quiet gatherings, a women's circle in Queens, a group of college students in Brooklyn, a public hospital where night shift nurses cared for psychiatric patients. Everywhere they went, Amara's eyes listened, and Andrew's voice always lowered when he spoke of loneliness. There were no standing ovations, but no one ever left early, and when they did leave, someone always turned away wiping silent tears. Maybe because they didn't show up as success stories, but as people who had once shattered and were still learning how to stand. One night after a community talk at a Bronx library, they sat on the steps outside, sharing a can of soda and a bag of popcorn. The wind snuck through their coats. Andrew gently pulled Amara's scarf up, a motion so familiar that she didn't flinch. "I didn't think anyone would listen," he said, eyes on the night sky. "They don't listen," she replied. "They feel." He turned. Their eyes met. No smiles, just a quiet steadiness, as if in a city constantly buzzing with invisible noise. They had found a rare note of silence to lean into one another without needing to say a thing. They weren't famous. They weren't awarded medals. No one turned their story into a film. But somehow their presence began to root itself in the invisible fractures within others. Fractures once dismissed, forgotten, labeled as a weakness. And from there, tiny sprouts began to grow, slow but enduring. Early May. The city stepped into that brief, magical season between cold and warmth. Trees once gray from winter turned green hesitantly, as if they were also learning to live again. Amara rode her bike through Riverside Park one late afternoon, her white shirt fluttering in the breeze, the basket full of fresh-cut lavender. Andrew walked beside her, sleeves rolled up, a canvas tote slung over his shoulder, a small book in hand. They didn't speak much, but between them, the air carried a kind of music that needed no notes. A photographer happened upon them by chance and snapped a photo. Just a simple shot, a white man and a black woman walking under a line of trees. No hand-holding, no kiss, no clear sign of affection. Yet in their shared silence, people saw something difficult to name. A very real sense of peace. A few days later, the photo was posted online with a quiet caption. In a chaotic world, sometimes just walking beside someone is enough. It went viral, not because of who they were, but because it reminded people of something we've all hoped for, to walk alongside someone in quiet, without needing to hide the softest parts of ourselves. A week later, the country's most respected digital newspaper reached out. They wanted to interview Andrew and Amara, not because of achievements, but because of their quiet impact. Letters had poured into Still Mind from all over: teenagers, single mothers, veterans, and even a pediatrician who once considered ending their life. They all said the same thing. I don't know who they are, but in the way they simply exist, I believe I'm not alone. Andrew read every letter under the dim glow of a desk lamp. Some were typed, some scribbled in pencil. One just said, "Thank you for not being too big to reach." Amara sorted them carefully, placing each in labeled folders. But one letter she set aside, tucking it into the small wooden box by her bed. It was from a 12-year-old girl, written in pencil. My mom says I'm strange, but when I saw Ms. Amara just sitting quietly in a video, I knew silence wasn't a mistake. Thank you. Netflix approached them cautiously. They didn't pitch a biopic, nor a dramatized origin story. Just a multi-part documentary series, honest conversations, unscripted meetings, where Andrew and Amara would visit those who had written in. Not to fix them, but to listen. Amara said nothing during the first meeting. She sat still, eyes distant, as if weighing something too delicate to speak aloud. Later, along with Andrew, she asked, "Will we still be us if the world starts telling our story in a language that doesn't belong to us?" Andrew said nothing at first. He understood her worry. Sincerity is fragile. Under lights, it's easily mistaken for moral branding or worse, PR strategy. But then he said, "We don't have to tell. We have to listen." Amara nodded, slowly, and something settled in her, like someone finally accepting that no one can keep light untouched. But if we stay quiet enough, it will find its way. The first episode was filmed in a small community center in New Orleans. A former prisoner spoke about the first time someone asked, "Have you eaten dinner without judgment or a hidden agenda?" A mother spoke of her autistic son, who only calmed when jazz music played. Amara didn't lead the sessions. Andrew didn't explain anything. They were present. And that made the stories raw, unvarnished, like bark unshaped by scripts or lenses. Viewers didn't cry. They didn't need to. But they lingered on the screen longer than usual before walking away. Their story became a quiet reference in conversations about digital-era mental care. Not as a trend, but as a gentle counterexample where gentleness itself became power. A magazine wrote, "Still Mind doesn't build a community. They build space and let people become a community for one another." No one has marked a line between Andrew before and Andrew now. No one labeled Amara. Was she his love partner or mirror? But people understood. When two souls become still enough to hear each other, something larger than both of them can be born. During a late-month event at the Museum of Modern Art, someone asked, "What makes you believe that these small things you do could touch the heart of the world?" Andrew answered without pause, "I'm not sure what will reach, but I believe what is reached always finds a way to respond, even without words. Amara, seated beside him, smiled. Not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for the man who once walked away from everything grand to learn how to hold on to something small and true. Early summer. The air was tinged with a quiet jazz. No tempo, no climax. Yet it drew listeners into a soft stillness. The small spa in Harlem was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a pause point for people between decisions, between wounds, or simply between two hurried breaths. The once empty wall now brimmed with handwritten notes. Each was a thank you, a memory fragment, a nameless whisper. No one curated them. No one edited. They were placed there by hands that once trembled and later steadied. Amara stood in the center of the room, looking toward the window, where sunlight spilled sideways across the wooden floor. Today marked exactly 1 year since Andrew returned to Harlem. No celebration, no cake, no banner. Just a pot of mint tea heated more carefully than usual, and 2 ceramic cups side by side on the low table in the corner. Andrew entered, just as the wind chime rang gently. The breeze tugged at his ivory shirt. He hadn't worn a suit in a long time. Their eyes met. Not for long, but not in passing. Just long enough to say, time has passed, and what remains now truly belongs to us. That night, they sat on the rooftop of the old building. The string lights flickered like fallen stars that hadn't yet let go. Below, Harlem slept. Above, the sky spread like dark ink scattered with stubborn stars, refusing to fade beneath the city's glow. Andrew held a small wooden box in his hands. Amara tilted her head. "What's that?" He opened it. Inside were folded papers, their edges curled with time. She recognized them instantly. They were the letters she had written, but never sent, tucked into an old drawer after every time he walked out of her life, even for a little while. "I thought you'd never read them," she said softly. "I never missed a single word," he replied. She said nothing. The night breeze carried the scent of old wood and her hair. He unfolded one note. The slanted handwriting read, "There are days I hate you for making me believe in something that wasn't real. But I fear more is that it was real, and you didn't dare to hold on to it." Amara lowered her gaze, but she didn't pull her hand from his. Andrew placed the note back in the box. "I don't know what tomorrow will be," he said, his voice low, like the tide pressing gently against a quiet shore. "Maybe still mind won't survive. Maybe I'll mess up again. Maybe the world will get loud enough that I stop hearing you." He paused, looked straight into her. "But I want to say this. While my mind is quieter than it's ever been, I don't need you to make me better. I need you to let me be human." There was no dramatic swell in his voice, but the words fell into Amara like the season's first rain, slow, soft, true. Over the past year, they had walked through countless unnamed moments together. No wedding, no titles. No one called them a power couple. But somehow, they became 2 parallel lines, not out of fear of drifting apart, but because they understood each person needs space to be themselves. Amara still did her healing work. Andrew still wrote every morning. There were days they didn't see each other. But when they did, there was no need to begin again, because they'd never truly left each other long enough to require a return. At a quiet spring seminar, someone asked Andrew what made him give up a towering career for a peaceful life. He looked at Amara, who was turning a small wooden ring on her finger, her eyes tuned to a melody only she could hear, and he answered, "Because ordinary was something I never dared to dream of, until I met her." Amara didn't look at him, but her hand touched his, gently, warmly, just like the very first day. There's something strange about love. It doesn't ask to be declared. It doesn't ask to be defined. It only asks to be kept. In the way you pour someone a cup of tea without being asked. In the way you think of them when the cold arrives. In the silence between two people that makes your heart feel lighter. Andrew and Amara never said forever. But in every small thing they did together, there was something that never broke, never dried out. It simply continued, quietly, like wind, like breath, like love that doesn't need proving, only presence.